In the last video, I discussed piracy and copyright infringement in the 19th century and a little bit of plagiarism by showing definitions from 4 dictionaries from the 1800s and an article from the Review and Herald. However, one of the striking revelations you will find when reading the Ramik report is that this attorney never addresses the elephant in the room. The elephant being that Ellen White claimed that not only are her writings inspired by God, but that those who reject her writings reject God. This is why the origin of her writings and ideas are so important. Of course, when you claim to have knowledge and insight no other human being has, people are rightfully skeptical, unless you are born into Adventism. In that case, you usually accept that smart people have figured it out and you go along with your life. But if you ever decide to look deeper, to answer that nagging question in your mind, you soon begin to wonder if she was who she claimed to be. Because when you think about it, if her claims are true, Ellen White would be the most significant person to have lived in the past roughly 2,000 years. She would be more important than any president, ruler, artist, philosopher, inventor, scientist, and possibly even Martin Luther, who pioneered the Reformation. Why? Because she claimed God spoke to her and gave her instruction to be given to the church. She would be a new source of divine revelation. And we all crave to have new insight from heaven. Anything that connects our realm with the heavenly realm is an instant buy, because we all want to know more about what lies beyond. So I want to continue with this thread of plagiarism that I began in part 3 by focusing on some of her visions, dreams, and testimonies to the church. Because one question everyone has who has discovered Ellen White's plagiarism is whether or not it infiltrated her visions and dreams. To many, this is understandably a huge red flag. Let's begin by focusing on what Ramik calls one of the most important factors between piracy, copyright infringement, and that of plagiarism, which is the intent to mislead. One of the most important factors from a legal standpoint between the legal crime of piracy, copyright infringement, and the act of plagiarism, again, notice he does not call plagiarism a legal issue as he does piracy and copyright infringement, is the intention with which such appropriation is made. A plagiarist, therefore, takes from another and utilizes that which is taken with the intent that the appropriated material be viewed as originating with the appropriator and not the originator. Therefore, Paul was eminently correct in concluding from a literary viewpoint that the plagiarist always hopes that he will not be found out. And though more might be added from a legal viewpoint, the intent of the taker is of a paramount importance. Richarda Posnera, a judge and senior lecturer at the University of Chicago Law School, wrote in 2007, "Concealment is at the heart of plagiarism." I believe Ramik and Posner have summarized the plagiarism debate well in these statements, because I agree the major issue for anyone who dares to question the origin of her writings is not whether her books could be taken to court, as the church would like you to believe. The major issue is she claimed to be God's messenger, and that the Holy Spirit assisted in writing her books. Thus, an alternative origin raises questions. She wrote, among many examples, the Holy Ghost is the author of the Scriptures and of the Spirit of prophecy, which is another name for Ellen White's writings. I am glad that you are having success in selling my books, for thus you are giving to the world the light that God has given me. These books contain clear, straight, unalterable truth, and they should certainly be appreciated. The instruction they contain is not of human production. These claims have granted her the reputation within the church as the spirit of prophecy, and belief in her gift continues to be a sign that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the remnant church of Revelation. But now that many of her writings and some of her alleged supernatural experiences have been discovered in other books by those who test her claims, the question of intent is front and center. So isn't it fascinating that Ramik never addressed that she claimed to be a messenger of God or more than a prophet in his report? Instead, he chose to omit this very important context of claimed supernatural revelation. Of course, we are taught in Adventism that Ellen White had a meager education. So to address the intent of not quoting other authors, a fair question to ask ourselves is, did she know how to quote? Here is the periodical, The Health Reformer, from July 1873. This was published before almost all of her books were written. On page 220, we find Mrs. White's department and this article on proper education. If we look at the bottom of page 222, we find the initials of Ellen G. White. In this article, Ellen advocated educating the children and youth with good education and moral training. She spoke against the idleness and self-indulgence of the wealthy. Here at the bottom of page 220, she wrote, "I clipped from an exchange the following on everyday religion, and then included a quote from another publication." Then she wrote, "I am delighted to find the following in that invaluable work entitled The Young Ladies' Counselor by Reverend Daniel Wise. It can be obtained at any Methodist bookroom." She then went on to quote part of this chapter until the end. So as I review this, I see that she is aware of the concept of quotation marks and citing another author's work. It begs the question then, why as a rule does she avoid quoting in books that paint her as a prophet? What is her intent by not including quotations? If you do not use quotation marks, readers will believe it came from you. It's a simple concept. How much more important would this be in someone claiming to be the last day prophet to the world? Let's look at another example, this time from 1867. In this article, Ellen White is defending herself against accusations that she has copied from other health reformers. At one point, Ellen White, in describing how she saw a dress in visions, said, "Although I am as dependent upon the Spirit of the Lord in writing my views as I am in receiving them, yet the words I employ in describing what I have seen are my own." Here she is talking about describing the dresses she saw in vision. "Unless they be spoken to me by an angel," which I always enclose in marks of quotation. Again, we can see here she understands the idea of putting words that are not her own in quotation marks. You can see this play out in her books as they are filled with biblical quotation marks, but she intentionally chose not to quote other authors in her books even when using their extra-biblical narratives. Of course, by avoiding quotation marks, these extra-biblical narratives and ideas, as I showed in Part 2, then appear to originate with her, as if from the spirit of prophecy. Another example is when those around her inquired about the similarity between her inspired views on health and those views that were a part of the health reform movement happening in the United States at the very same time. She wrote, "That which I have written in regards to health was not taken from books or papers. As I related to others the things which I had been shown, the question was asked, 'Have you seen the paper The Laws of Life or the Water Cure Journal?' I told them no, I had not seen either of these papers. Said they, 'What you have seen agrees very much with much of their teachings.' I talked freely with Dr. Lay and many others upon the things which have been shown me in reference to health. I had never seen a paper treating upon health. After the vision was given me, my husband was aroused upon the health questions. He obtained books upon our Eastern journey, but I would not read them. My view was clear, and I did not want to read anything until I had fully completed my books. My views were written independent of books or of the opinions of others." Here Ellen White is making it clear that her views were written independent of books or of the opinions of others. Her material instead came from God. She mentions that even though she had the books in her home, she claimed that she did not read them because she wanted to write her views independent of books or opinions of others. Why did she want others to know she wrote her views independent of books or opinions of others? Because plagiarism brings a loss of reputation. She desired that her writings be viewed as originating with God and not man. Of course, we now see that her health writings were dependent on the thoughts of others in her day, many of which have been proven false. Now, remembering Ramik's argument that plagiarists take with the intent that the material be viewed as originating with them, I want to share a quote written by Willie White, son of Ellen White, 5 years after her death, where he recounted a conversation with his mother. He wrote, "In the early days of her work, Mother, Ellen White here, was promised wisdom in the selection from the writings of others that would enable her to select the gems of truth from the rubbish of error. We have all seen this fulfilled, and yet when she told me of this, she admonished me not to tell it to others. Why thus restricted I never knew, but now I'm inclined to believe that she saw how this might lead some of her brethren to claim too much for her writings as a standard with which to correct historians." I can imagine Willie White walking into Ellen White's office as she is writing, and he looks over and sees her copying from other books, which immediately causes him to question what she is doing. Then she calls him over and says, "Shh, this is okay, son. God told me to copy from other writers, but I don't want you to tell anyone else, okay?" It makes you wonder why she was so secretive about where she gathered her material. Why did she deny copying others? You know, when people are caught doing something wrong, they usually make an excuse as to why they performed the act. And then they tell the one who catches them, "Please don't tell anyone." I wonder what Ramik would say regarding this warning of hers. Even her son was puzzled by her admonishment. Now, since Ellen White claimed that her health ideas were not taken from other authors, both in 1867 and in 1897, let's see where they did originate from, and turn to a famous example from Walter Ray's book, The White Lie. On the right, I have an original 1873 edition of Testimonies to the Church, volume 20 to 22 by Ellen White, with the first of these testimonies from 1871. And on the left, I have a copy of Philosophy of Health, written 14 years before Ellen White's alleged inspired testimony, here published in 1857 by Millerite preacher, physician, and health reformer L.B. Coles. It's important to note that Coles, among others in this time period, advocated for exercise, diet restrictions such as the elimination of coffee and tea, avoiding medications, quitting smoking, and meatless diets. If you're an Adventist, these concepts will be very familiar to you, and you may even be under the impression that these were unique ideas to Ellen White. If you would like to read more about the health reform movement, I highly recommend the book Prophetess of Health by historian Ronald Numbers, who was a previous lecturer at Loma Linda University. This book discusses much of where the health ideas Ellen White espoused originated from. Let's begin with the paragraph before Ray's example. Parents bequeath to their offspring their own perverted habits, and loathsome diseases corrupt the blood and enervate the brain. This first sentence echoes Cole's beliefs on page 88 that if parents violated their health, these traits would be passed down to their children. Thus, the parents have a responsibility in regard to their offspring originating prior to their birth. So, for example, if a parent drinks coffee, Coles would argue that it would alter the nervous system and the quality of the blood itself. Then these traits will be passed down to the children. Or, the propensities of the parents in eating and drinking or eating meat may cause their children to inherit these appetites, which result in wrongful activity and morals. Next, the majority of men and women remain in ignorance of the laws of their being, and indulge appetite and passion at the expense of intellect and morals, and seem willing to remain in ignorance of the result of their violation of nature's laws. On the bottom of page 140, Coles wrote much of the same. It is every individual's duty to study the laws of their being and to conform to them. Ignorance or inattention of this subject is sin, and the injurious consequences of such a course of gradual suicide. Continuing on, they indulge the depraved appetite in the use of slow poisons, which corrupt the blood and undermine the nervous forces, and in consequence bring upon themselves sickness and death. Their friends call the result of their own course the dispensation of providence. In this they insult heaven. They rebelled against the laws of nature and suffered the punishment of her abused laws. You can see the outline of these thoughts on page 141 of Coles. Suffering and mortality now prevail everywhere, especially among the children. How great is the contrast between this generation and those who lived during the first 2,000 years. This last sentence could possibly be attributed to the ideas of Horace Mann, but that's a subject for another day. Let's continue as Ellen now asks heaven a question. I inquired if this tide of woe could not be prevented, and something done to save the youth of this generation from ruin which threatens them. I was shown one great cause of the existing deplorable state of things is that parents do not feel under obligation to bring up their children to conform to physical law. Mothers love their children with an idolatrous love, and they indulge their appetite when they know that it will injure the health of their children and thereby bring upon them disease and unhappiness. This cruel kindness is carried out to a great extent in the present generation. We can see here that Ellen White claimed to have asked heaven what could be done to save the youth from ruin, and then immediately after saying she was shown in vision, continues to copy from Coles. As you can see before, and as you will see after the vision segment, she is simply copying the ideas from Coles, and this continues during the alleged vision as well. What was her intent in appropriating this material, Mr. Ramik? Why the deception? Let's continue. The desires of children are gratified at the expense of health and happy tempers, because it is easier for the mother for the time being to gratify than to withhold that which her children clamor for. These mothers are sowing the seed that will spring up and bear fruit. The children are not educated to deny their appetites and restrict their desires. And they become selfish, exacting, disobedient, unthankful, and unholy. Mothers who are doing this work of sowing will reap with bitterness the seed they have sown. These sentences are related to what is found on page 98 and in the overall chapter from Coles on parents and guardians. In this chapter, Coles argues that if you feed a child more than 3 times a day, you are giving into their desires and violating the laws of nature. This will thus end with poor health, and they will develop immediate gratification. Ellen White here writes much of the same. Going back to page 145, and again from Coles, and under the title of the Spirit of Prophecy, she copied, "They have sinned against heaven and against their children, and God will hold them accountable." In the next section, she copies from a few different pages, so I will be flipping back and forth. Had the system of education generations back been conducted upon altogether a different plan, the youth of this generation would not have been so depraved and worthless. The managers and teachers of school should have been those who understand physiology and who have had an interest not only to educate youth in the sciences, but to test them how to preserve health in order to use their knowledge to the best account after they had obtained it. Now on page 102 and 103, Coles writes about various branches of labor that also include exercise such as a mechanic shop or agricultural pursuits. He also mentions that bowling alleys and gymnasiums are amusements that offer exercise. Ellen writes much the same without giving specifics. There should have been in connection with the schools establishments for various branches of labor, that the students might have employment and necessary exercise out of school hours. The students' employment and amusements should have been regulated in reference to physical law, and adapted to preserve to them the healthy tone of all the powers of the body and mind. I will finish by turning back to page 145 in Coles. Then their education in practical business could have been obtained, while their literary progress was being secured. Students at school should have had their moral sensibilities aroused to see and feel that society had claims upon them, and that they should so live in obedience to natural law that they could, by their existence and influence, by precept and example, be an advantage and blessing to society. Let's stop here and move to another example from Coles, this time from researcher Dirk Anderson and his website nonegw.org. Similar to the last example, as I kept looking, I found more and more similarities to Coles. This time we'll be looking at Testimonies for the Church, Volume 2, and I will have Coles' book again here on the left. We'll be looking at the section entitled Flesh Meats and Stimulants. But before we do that, let's read what Ellen White wrote about this testimony in her introduction to testimony number 15. My brethren and sisters will hardly expect this number of my testimonies so soon, but I had many personal testimonies on hand, some of which are given in the following pages, and I know of no better way to present my views of general dangers and errors and the duty of all who love God and keep His commandments than by giving these testimonies. Perhaps there is no more direct and forcible way of presenting what the Lord has shown me. So in this same testimony containing the information that she claimed the Lord has showed her, we're going to look at page 63 in this chapter, Flesh, Meats, and Stimulants. She wrote, "Will the people who are preparing to become holy, pure, and refined, that they may be introduced into the society of heavenly angels, continue to take the life of God's creatures and subsist on their flesh and enjoy it as luxury? From what the Lord has shown me, this order of things will be changed, and God's peculiar people will exercise temperance in all things." She starts off by making the claim that to enter the society of heaven, the remnant or last-day church will cease eating meat to become holy, pure, and refined. She continues on page 64. Those who subsist largely upon flesh cannot avoid eating the meat of animals, which are to a greater or less degree diseased. The process of fitting animals for market produces in them disease, and is fitted in as healthy manners as they can be. They become heated and diseased by driving before they reach the market. The fluids and flesh of these diseased animals are received directly into the blood and pass into the circulation of the human body, becoming fluids and flesh of the same. These humors are introduced into the system, and if the person already has impure blood, it is greatly aggravated by the eating of the flesh of these animals. The liability to take disease is increased tenfold by meat eating. The intellectual, the moral, and the physical powers are depreciated by the habitual use of flesh meats. Meat eating deranges the system, beclouds the intellect, and blunts the moral sensibilities. We say to you, dear brother and sister, your safest course is to let meat alone. So according to the spirit of prophecy, or should I say L.B. Coles, if you eat meat, you will become unintelligent, weak, and will become immoral. In our current time, when we think of stimulants, we typically think of cocaine or amphetamines. But with the health reformers who preceded Ellen White, when the word stimulants was used, it typically meant caffeine and tea. I'm looking forward to going into more detail at a later date about these health ideas that Ellen White espoused and where they came from. But as I mentioned before, the book Prophetess of Health by Ronald Numbers is an excellent book on the subject if you'd like to read more. Continuing on, the use of tea and coffee is also injurious to the system. To a certain extent, tea produces intoxication. It enters into the circulation and gradually impairs the energy of body and mind. It stimulates, excites, and quickens the motion of the living machinery, forcing it to unnatural action, and thus gives the tea drinker the impression that it is doing him great service, imparting to him strength. This is a mistake. Tea draws upon the strength of the nerves and leaves them greatly weakened. When its influence is gone and the increased action caused by its use is abated, then what is the result? Languor and debility corresponding to the artificial vivacity the tea imparted. When the system is already overtaxed and needs rest, the use of tea spurs up nature by stimulation to perform unwanted, unnatural action, and thereby lessens her power to perform and her ability to endure. And her powers give out long before heaven designed they should. Tea is poisonous to the system. Christians should let it alone. These types of insights are why many Adventists avoid tea and coffee, not because Coles said it, but because the spirit of prophecy claims to have received these insights from God. These are her testimonies as a messenger of the Lord to the remnant church, as what she claimed the Lord had shown her. And if you reject these views, you reject God. Let's continue. The influence of coffee is in a degree the same as tea, but the effect upon the system is still worse. Its influence is exciting, and just in the degree that it elevates above par, it will exhaust and bring prostration below par. Tea and coffee drinkers carry the marks upon their faces. The skin becomes shallow and assumes a lifeless appearance. The glow of health is not seen upon the countenance. I could go on, but I will stop here for the sake of time. You know, I was curious, what would Ellen White say if you neglected or refused her health ideas? Turning to page 66, we read a letter to a family that was not practicing her health ideas. She wrote, "The Lord has shown some things in regard to you which I feel it is a duty to write. You are among the number who were presented before me as backward in health reform. Light has shone upon the pathway in which the people of God are traveling, yet all do not walk in the light and follow as fast as the providence of God marks out and opens the way before them. Until they do this, they will be in darkness. If God has spoken to his people, he designs that they should hear and obey his voice," meaning if you turn away from Ellen White's health messages, you are turning away from the voice of God. "Last Sabbath, as I was speaking, your pale faces rose distinctly before me as I had been shown them. I saw your condition of health and the ailments you have suffered under so long. I was shown that you have not lived healthfully." She wrote on page 69 to this family, "Thousands have indulged their perverted appetites, have eaten a good meal as they call it, and as a result have brought on a fever or some acute disease and certain death. That was enjoyment purchased at immense cost. Yet many have done this, and these self-murderers have been eulogized by their friends, and the minister and carried directly to heaven at their death. What a thought! Gluttons in heaven! No, no, such will never enter the pearly gates of the golden city of God. Such will never be exalted to the right hand of Jesus, the precious Savior, the suffering man of Calvary, whose life was one of constant self-denial and sacrifice. There is a place appointed for all such among the unworthy, who can have no part in the better life, the immortal inheritance." So Ellen is claiming that the amount of food we eat can keep us out of heaven. In contrast, she writes, there is a special place appointed for those gluttons outside of heaven. This makes me wonder, how does she equate eating too much with salvation? It is just as much sin to violate the laws of our being as to break one of the 10 Commandments. for we cannot do either without breaking God's law. So if you're drinking tea or coffee, eating meat, or simply eating too much food, it's as if you're breaking one of the 10 Commandments, according to Ellen White. And yet Roger Kuhn, former associate director of the White Estate, wrote on Ellen's health message, "The laws of health are not placed by God at the same level as the 10 Commandments." But it appears Ellen thinks so. So who do I believe, Ellen or Roger Kuhn? But given Ellen's grand emphasis on the 10 Commandments in her writings, I figured at least this must be an original thought. But it's not. On page 216 of Cole's book, he wrote, "It is truly a sin against heaven to violate a law of life as to break one of the 10 Commandments." It's interesting to me that not only are her health teachings based on the health reformers, but also the consequences of violating those same health ideas. Let's continue with the subject of health reform for a few more minutes. In April of 1897, Ellen White wrote a letter about a brother McCullough, who was an Adventist pastor in Australia that had given up her testimonies and left the church. He had also stated in a large congregation that she picked things up from books and sent them out as something the Lord had shown her. She wrote that she had spoken to Brother McCullough in regards to his diet and said, "I have had great light from the Lord upon the subject of health reform. I did not seek this light. I did not study to obtain it. It was given to me by the Lord to give to others." How am I supposed to reconcile a statement such as this when I can clearly see her health writings are from other authors? Here, Ellen attempts to defend herself against these accusations by McCullough by stating the Lord gave her the light on health reform and that she did not study to obtain it. But this alleged light already existed in bookstores and in the general growing health movement around her. So we must ask, what is her intent in denying that she did not study these things, but instead received it from heaven? Of course, she cannot say, "I read Cole's and formed my health views by intense study," without losing her reputation. This is why she didn't quote. What's interesting is that 2 months after this letter, in June of 1897, Ellen wrote a letter to Fanny Bolton, one of her literary assistants, about the same brother McCullough who left the church. She wrote to Fanny, "McCullough stated in a large congregation that it was reported by one who knew that I picked up things written in books and sent them out as something the Lord has shown me. At the Bible Institute in Cornbong, McCullough told me that you, Fanny Bolton, had made a statement to him and his wife similar to the statement made to Sister Malcolm. Your sowing is producing its harvest. Many in Melbourne have been repeating the same things which you have told them, and which they thought must be true." Here Ellen is stern with her literary assistant and says, "Look, it's going around that I am taking things from other books and sending them out as something the Lord has shown me." And yet this is exactly what we find that she has done, even while denying that she took from others on the subject of health reform just a few months earlier. Remember what Ramik said? A plagiarist does not want to be found out. So first I see she denies studying to obtain her health reform views from others. Then she chastises her assistant when she thinks she let the word out. All of this occurring 1 year before The Desire of Ages was published, containing vast amounts of plagiarism. Now that we've seen examples that much of her health reform came from other authors, let's examine how her ideas impact salvation. Here is a Review and Herald from August 8th, 1899, where she wrote, "Parents should impress upon their children that it is a sin to consult the taste to the injury of the stomach. They should impress upon their minds that by violating the laws of their being, they sin against their Maker." So with this in mind, I'll show you a selection from the Ministry of Healing, published 6 years later. In this fast age, the less exciting the food, the better. Condiments are injurious in their nature. Mustard, pepper, spices, pickles, and other things of a like character irritate the stomach and make the blood feverish and impure. The inflamed condition of the drunkard's stomach is often pictured as illustrating the effects of alcoholic liquors. A similarly inflamed condition is produced by the use of irritating condiments. In Testimonies for the Church, Volume 7 from 1902, we find, "Those who teach the principles of health reform should be intelligent in regard to disease and its causes, understanding that every action of the human agent should be in perfect harmony with the laws of life. The light God has given on health reform is for our salvation and the salvation of the world. Hold up the principles of health reform and let the Lord lead the honest in heart. Present the principles of temperance in their most attractive form. circulate the books that give instruction in regard to healthy living. The Lord has been sending us line upon line, and if we reject these principles, we are not rejecting the messenger who teaches them, but the one who has given us the principles. It is impossible to work for the salvation of men and women without presenting to them the need of breaking away from sinful gratifications which destroy the health. Again, health reform is a salvific issue. She wrote here that if we reject these principles, the ones that she copied from other authors, we are rejecting God. Not only that, but in order for a person to be saved, they must give up any vice of food or drink that is out of line with her health reform. That is what she is referring to when she writes sinful gratifications. So, if you put mustard on your child's veggie hot dog to enhance the taste, you are causing them to sin against God. And when Jesus comes to your child's name in the investigative judgment, if your child has not repented of using mustard, one wonders if Jesus will have to decide if a flavored hot dog will keep that child out of heaven. You may think this is completely absurd or that I'm being sarcastic, blasphemous, or taking this to an extreme. But as I contemplate the idea that violating her health reform light is sin, and as we read earlier when she wrote, it is just as much sin to violate the laws of our being as to break one of the 10 commandments, then it would not be unreasonable that the sin of a flavored hot dog would be a significant issue. You can't possibly think as an Adventist that you can intentionally violate the 10 commandments or their equivalent and pass through the investigative judgment. The way I see it, Ellen White has placed a stumbling block in the way of salvation with her health reform. This is why in the traditional baptismal vows you must agree to abstain from unclean foods and substances in order to get into the remnant church. It's all very cleverly woven together, and yet, growing up in the Adventist church, I was under the impression that her health ideas were unique to her and unprecedented in her times, and thus only further proof of her prophetic gift. Let's look at one more example on health reform. In Testimonies for the Church, Volume 9, when addressing the delegates at the General Conference in Washington, D.C. on May 31, 1909, she wrote, "I am instructed to bear a message to all our people on the subject of health reform, for many have backslidden from their former loyalty to health reform principles. Those who have received instruction regarding the evils of the use of flesh foods, tea and coffee, and rich and unhealthy food preparations, and who are determined to make a covenant with God by sacrifice, will not continue to indulge their appetite for food that they know to be unhealthful. God demands that the appetite be cleansed and that self-denial be practiced in regard to those things which are not good. This is a work that will have to be done before his people can stand before him, a perfected people." Once again, practicing health reform appears to be a requirement of salvation and a required antecedent to his return. Who would have thought the reason God has not returned could possibly be that Adventists are putting condiments on their food? Now, I've said quite a bit so far, so it would be fair to read what the Whites themselves published in defense of Ellen in their autobiography entitled Life Sketches, published in 1880. I think it's interesting that even all the way back to 1880, they had to go on the defensive. Perhaps there was not enough proof of her gift at this time, or too many doubted her claimed insight from heaven. I don't know, but from reading this passage, it appears that this was the case. On page 326, we find this passage. "The peculiar experience and extensive labors of Mrs. White have called out expressions from the pious, from the curious, and from those who have cherished a spirit toward her and her work as bitter as gall. And the very nature of the case seems to demand that we should make the following points." Notice he says we, which suggests Ellen and James are collaborating on this defense. Had Mrs. White been spared the blow which made her an invalid in her childhood, had she grown to womanhood with health and strength to obtain a finished education, and had she come before the people under these favorable circumstances as a speaker and writer, the unbelief of our times, so ready to seize upon objections, would have given the credit of her work to the woman and not to the Lord. So as you read here, they make the claim that because of her unique experience of severe trauma to her face when she was a child, we should believe that her work was from the Lord. If she had been an ordinary woman, we would have credited the work to herself. Here is the first claim, that because she was hit with a rock, she was at a disadvantage, and thus her literary output can only be explained by the work of the Lord. This is why plagiarism is an issue for a couple who builds their defense on this story. This is the premise that is the foundation for the rest of the defense in this chapter. Let's continue. For the special work connected with the last message, at this time of unparalleled skepticism, God chose a feeble means that his power might be clearly manifested, and that the glory of his work might be given to the instrument. The words of Paul are applicable. Ye see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. James writes here that Ellen White is the weak thing of the world that is going to be used to confound the things which are mighty. Next, he further elaborates on this narrative. At the age of 9 years, Mrs. White received a blow which broke her nose and which made her an invalid during the period of her schoolgirl days, depriving her of the advantages of an education. At 17, she received her first vision, as described on page 193. This occurred in the month of December 1844. In a few weeks, she left the home of her parents in great feebleness and went out into the cold of midwinter in Maine to relate to others what God had revealed to her. Her work for the past 35 years, commenced under these discouraging circumstances, has continued with scarcely an interruption up to the present time. During this time, she has written thousands of personal testimonies, has raised her family, and much of the time been on the wing from state to state to speak to the people. She has 5,000 pages of her writings in the field. Again, one of the main burden of proofs for Ellen White has always largely rested on the amount of material she was able to publish with her third-grade education. This is not the entire argument that was presented to us in Adventism, but a significant portion. This is why plagiarism undermines her story and why the church must go to great lengths to attempt to prove that she was not a plagiarist. There's nothing miraculous if you write books based off other authors. James, continuing with this argument for his wife, wrote, Does unbelief suggest that what she writes in her personal testimonies has been learned from others? We inquire, what time has she had to learn all these facts? And who for a moment can regard her as a Christian woman if she gives ear to gossip and writes it out as a vision from God? And where is the person of superior natural and acquired abilities who could listen to the description of 1, 2, or 3,000 cases, all differing, and then write them out without getting them confused, laying the whole work liable to 1,000 contradictions? If Mrs. White has gathered the facts from a human mind in a single case, she has in thousands of cases, and God has not shown her these things which she has written in these personal testimonies. It's quite interesting to read her husband boldly saying that she did not learn her material from others. He asks, how can someone regard her as a Christian woman who then uses what she hears to write out a vision? Again, he is stating in print in 1880 that it would be wrong to write a vision that came from a human source. James is coming out strong against the idea that she has used other authors or individuals' ideas in her writings. He says if she did it once, she did it 1,000 times. He is arguing in favor of her narrative that she was a weak, low-educated woman who was given the gift of visions for the end-time church. Let's continue. In her published works, there are many things set forth which cannot be found in other books, and yet they are so clear and beautiful that the unprejudiced mind grasps them at once as truth. A doctor of divinity once heard Mrs. White speak upon her favorite theme, God and nature. She dwelt largely upon the life and teachings of Christ. This Christian gentleman was instructed and highly edified, and at the close of the discourse in private conversation addressed her in these words, Sister White, while you were speaking, I have been asking myself the question, why is it that none of us have thought of these precious things which you have brought out this morning? Now James digs in. Pay close attention. If commentators and theological writers generally had seen these gems of thought which strike the mind so forcibly, and had they been brought out in print, all the ministers in the land could have read them. These men gather thoughts from books, and as Mrs. White has written and spoken 100 things as truthful as they are beautiful and harmonious, which cannot be found in the writings of others, they are new to the most intelligent readers and hearers. And if they are not to be found in print, and are not brought out in sermons from the pulpit, where did Mrs. White find them? From what source has she received the new and rich thoughts which are to be found in her writings and oral addresses? she could not have learned them from books, from the fact that they do not contain such thoughts. And certainly she did not learn them from other ministers who had not thought of them. The case is a clear one. It clearly requires 100 times the credulity to believe that Mrs. White had learned these things of others and has palmed them off as visions from God than it does to believe that the Spirit of God has revealed them to her. James begins by stating that ministers gather thoughts from books, but Mrs. White has written and spoken 100 things which cannot be found in the writings of others. They are new to even the most intelligent of people. He is separating her from the average minister or author. She has special insight from heaven. James doubles down and says, if they cannot be found in print and they are not from sermons, where did she find them? From what source? He states, she could not have learned them from books, and concludes that it requires much more faith to believe she learned things from others and palmed them off as visions from God. Maybe he was unaware of the one I showed you just a few minutes ago, written 8 years before this book was published. There is an obvious moral issue that is coming up here. There is something wrong with claiming your writings are from God when they are from human sources. This is a topic Ramik never brings up for obvious reasons. But I find it striking that the Whites felt that they needed to add this in print. Obviously, individuals were accusing her of plagiarism in 1880, and they wanted to go on the defensive in print. James concludes, the spirit of prophecy has been appealing to the church through Mrs. White during the past 35 years in behalf of the Bible, the commandments of God, and the faith of Jesus, setting forth practical godliness as the test of Christian character. The fruits of her teaching and labors have been good, and only good. Here is the Lord's test. Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns, or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. Matthew 7:16 and 17. Is that really the only test in Scripture, though? No, there are many more. But I find this good fruit test is brought up often to somehow prove that Ellen White was a true prophet, because she had sold a lot of books and started many Adventist institutions. But all of these successes are based off the belief that she was a prophet. Who would avoid purchasing new knowledge from the heavenly fountain? In addition, what organization could not build several institutions with 10% of its members' salaries flowing into the church? Everyone wants to know more about God, and I see here in 1880, by saying that the spirit of prophecy has been appealing to the church through Mrs. White, the Whites are offering the ticket to that new information. James concludes, Gamaliel, a reputable doctor of the law, said, refrain from these men and let them alone. For if this counsel or this work be of men, it will come to naught. But if it be of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest happily ye be found even to fight against God. The subject under consideration seems to demand that the scriptural evidence of the perpetuity of spiritual gifts and their design should constitute a chapter of this work. Now, 2 years following the biographical passage we just read defending her gift, Ellen White wrote a testimony to the Battle Creek Church included in the 1882 Testimonies to the Church, Volume 5, and a chapter entitled, The Testimonies Slighted. Let's see how she expected church members to view her warnings. She wrote, for years the Lord has been presenting the situation of the church before you. Again and again reproofs and warnings have been given. October 23, 1879, the Lord gave me a most impressive testimony in regard to the church in Battle Creek. During the last months I was with you, I carried a heavy burden for the church, while those who should have felt to the very depths of their souls were comparatively easy and unconcerned. I knew not what to do or what to say. I had no confidence in the course which many were pursuing, for they were doing the very things which the Lord had warned them not to do. She goes on to write, many excuse their disregard of the testimonies by saying, Sister White is influenced by her husband. The testimonies are molded by his spirit and judgment. Others were seeking to gain something from me which they could construe to justify their course or to give them influence. It was then I decided that nothing more should go from my pen until the converting power of God was seen in the church. But the Lord placed the burden upon my soul. I labored for you earnestly. How much this cost both my husband and myself, eternity will tell. Have I not a knowledge of the state of the church when the Lord has presented their case before me again and again for years? Repeated warnings have been given, yet there has been no decided change. Ellen White strengthens her claims further down the page. Yet now when I send you a testimony of warning and reproof, many of you declare it to be merely the opinion of Sister White. You have thereby insulted the Spirit of God. You know how the Lord has manifested himself through the spirit of prophecy. Past, present, and future have passed before me. I have been shown faces that I had never seen, and years afterward I knew them when I saw them. I have been aroused from my sleep with a vivid sense of subjects preciously presented to my mind, and I have written at midnight letters that have gone across the continent, and arriving at a crisis, have saved great disaster to the cause of God. This has been my work for many years. A power has impelled me to reprove and rebuke wrongs that I had not thought of. Is this work of the last 36 years from above or from beneath? She makes many supernatural claims here, including the fact that if you believe her writings are merely the opinion of her, you are insulting God. As elsewhere, she writes that her work is either from God or the devil. But what does she say happens if you push a little further and disregard her instruction? If you seek to turn aside the counsel of God to suit yourselves, if you lessen the confidence of God's people in the testimonies he has sent them, which are her writings, you are rebelling against God, as certainly as were Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. If you recall from Numbers chapter 16, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram were three men who led an uprising to challenge Moses' authority. Soon the Lord demonstrated to these men and their followers that they were in error and opened the earth around them and swallowed them whole. Then the earth closed upon them, and they were never seen again. So if you ignore Ellen White's counsel, or lessen the confidence of others in her writings, she is saying you are rebelling against God, as these men did. But by bringing up this iconic story, you cannot ignore the undertones that death may result from your disobedience. How do statements like these invite investigation of her prophetic gift? How can an Adventist have the courage to question her and test her? Who would want to rebel against God? She goes on again, speaking about her testimonies. When I went to Colorado, I was so burdened for you that in my weakness I wrote many pages to be read at your camp meeting. Weak and trembling, I arose at 3 o'clock in the morning to write to you. God was speaking through clay. You might say that this communication was only a letter. Yes, it was a letter, but prompted by the Spirit of God to bring before your minds things that had been shown me. In these letters which I write, in the testimonies I bear, I am presenting to you which the Lord has presented to me. I do not write one article in the paper expressing merely my own ideas. They are what God has opened before me in vision, the precious rays of light shining from the throne. Here she further strengthens her claims that the testimonies she writes are what the Lord has presented to her. They are not simply her own ideas, but what God has shown her in vision. She is the link between the throne and the earthly realm, with eternal consequences if not taken seriously. An angel of God was by my side, and I seemed to be in Battle Creek. I was in your councils. I heard words uttered. I saw and heard things that, if God willed, I wish could be forever blotted from my memory. Again, while in prayer, the Lord revealed himself. I was once more in Battle Creek. I was in many houses and heard your words around your tables. The particulars I have no liberty now to relate. I hope never to be called to mention them. I had also several most striking dreams. Just imagine living at this time, and there is someone claiming to be a prophet and saying that she knows intimate details about your life behind closed doors. She claims to hear what you've said around the dinner table, and who knows where else. Again, how do statements like these not instill fear? You never know if Ellen was in the room with you watching what you were doing. Next, she begins to lay down her argument about faith in her authority. She wrote, "What voice will you acknowledge as the voice of God? What power has the Lord in reserve to correct your errors and show you your course as it is? What power to work in the church if you refuse to believe until every shadow of uncertainty and every possibility of doubt is removed? You will never believe. The doubt that demands perfect knowledge will never yield to faith. Faith rests upon evidence, not demonstration. The Lord requires us to obey the voice of duty. When there are other voices all around us urging us to pursue an opposite course, it requires earnest attention from us to distinguish the voice which speaks from God. We must resist and conquer inclination and obey the voice of conscience without parleying or compromise, lest its promptings cease and will and impulse control. Here, Ellen is making the case that we should not refuse to believe in her testimonies until every doubt or uncertainty is removed. She wrote that when there are other voices around us urging us to pursue an opposite course, such as those who lessen the confidence in her writings, we should obey the voice of duty instead. Researcher Christopher Pitta, who has spent over a decade researching her plagiarism using original books, has found plagiarized material in her visions, testimonies, letters, and her well-known books all the way to Prophets and Kings. And he pointed out that this claim is actually from Daniel March in his book Night Scenes in the Bible, here in this edition from 1870, written 9 years before this letter to the Battle Creek Church. However, in context, Daniel March is writing about Elijah, but Ellen changes it to belief in her prophetic gift, and never lets her readers in on where this paragraph and its instruction is from. But as I continued to read these two books side by side, I found that it wasn't simply this one paragraph that she lifted from March. She continued, "The word of the Lord comes to us all who have not resisted his Spirit by determining not to hear and obey. This voice is heard in warnings, in counsels, in reproof. It is the Lord's message of light to his people. If we wait for louder calls or better opportunities, the light may be withdrawn and we left in darkness. So if you disregard her testimonies, God may withdraw his light from the church, and they will be left in darkness." Quite the ultimatum, isn't it? But this is Daniel March's ultimatum that Ellen White had to search to find. Again, Daniel March never claimed divine inspiration. Let's keep going. By once neglecting to comply with the call of God's Spirit and his word, when obedience involves a cross, many have lost much. How much they will never know till the books are opened at the final day. The pleadings of the Spirit, neglected today because of pleasure or inclination, leads in an opposite direction, may be powerless to convince or even impress tomorrow. To improve the opportunities of the present with prompt and willing hearts is the only way to grow in grace and the knowledge of the truth. We should ever cherish a sense that individually we are standing before the Lord of hosts. No word, no act, no thought, even, should be indulged to offend the eye of the Eternal One. We shall then have no fear of man or of earthly power, because a monarch, whose empire is the universe, who holds in his hands our individual destinies for time and eternity, is taking cognizance of all our work. If we would feel that in every place we are the servants of the Most High, we would be more circumspect. Our whole life would possess to us a meaning and sacredness which earthly honors can never give. The thoughts of the heart, the words of the lips, and every act of the life will make our character more worthy, if the presence of God is continually felt. Let the language of the heart be, "Lo, God is here." Then the life will be pure, the character unspotted, the soul continually uplifted to the Lord. I find it interesting that an alleged prophet had to go to her bookcase to search for something to say to the Battle Creek Church. Could she not think of anything? And she surely did not want anyone to know where this part of her testimony came from. This entire testimony, she has instead rebuked this church and told them that this was not simply her opinion, and if they treated her words as if they were simply her opinion, that they insulted God. This means what she wrote here is meant to come across as divine revelation or instruction, and yet, as with her other books, she has misled her audience as to the origin of her divine revelation. This reminds me of what the attorney said. A plagiarist takes from another and utilizes that which is taken with the intent that the appropriated material be viewed as originating with them, as the spirit of prophecy, and not the one who originally wrote it. Ellen continues to write in the next few pages about her warnings and the light she received that they rejected. Then, after making many claims, Ellen begins to describe visions regarding the unbelief in her testimonies. On the left side, I'll be showing what Mr. Pitta discovered in Elijah the Tishbite, written by German theologian F.W. Krummacher in 1838, 44 years before her testimony. I have been shown that unbelief in the testimonies, her writings, have been steadily increasing as the people backslide from God. It is all through our ranks, all over the field. But few know what our churches are to experience. I saw that at present we are under divine forbearance, but no one can say how long this will continue. No one knows how great the mercy that has been exercised toward us, but few are heartily devoted to God. Here, after going on and on in this testimony about those who have turned their back on God for not believing in her testimonies, Ellen tells those in the church, few know what our churches are to experience. Again, she's warning those unbelievers that she has the hidden knowledge. She has seen the future. Then she says that she saw in vision that at the current time there was divine forbearance or restraint, but we do not know how long this will continue. After introducing fear, she alludes about present mercy being exercised towards those Adventists who do not believe her testimonies. There are few that are heartily devoted to God. She writes as though these are witnessed events through a vision, or she has some sort of secret knowledge about what is happening in the church. But from what I see, she has simply took a book from a foreign author and passed off his ideas while pretending to see something in vision regarding the devotion of those to God who do not believe in her warnings. Fascinating, isn't it? I must ask, what is her intent, Mr. Ramik? Is she intending that this material be viewed as the spirit of prophecy, or as Mr. Krummacher? How is this not lying? How am I supposed to have confidence in Ellen White's writings as an Adventist with deception like this? I have tried in my studies to be fair and objective to both sides of the debate, but when I see examples such as this one, it really boggles my mind that a true prophet would resort to plagiarism while claiming to have a supernatural vision about those who did not believe in their messages. Not to mention, she wrote, "In the testimony sent to Battle Creek, I have given you the light God has given to me. In no case have I given my own judgment or opinion. I have enough to write of what has been shown me without falling back on my own opinions." Now, remember the autobiography Life Sketches that we looked at a few moments ago that was published in 1880, where James wrote 3 pages of arguments in defense of his wife? Well, James White died in 1881, the year after it was published. Then 2 years later, one of Ellen White's most controversial books, Sketches from the Life of Paul, was published in 1883. This book was found to be heavily copied from a few European authors and was removed from print a few years later, only to return later in a revised form as the Acts of the Apostles in 1911. But in 1887 and 1888, as I demonstrated in the last video, Adventist pastor and close friend of Ellen White, D.M. Canwright, exposed her plagiarism in print. Now what's fascinating is that Ellen White decided to publish a second edition of Life Sketches in 1888. The same year, the great controversy suddenly appeared with vague credits. In this second edition, following the accusations of Canwright, she erased much of what her husband had wrote about her source of information. Let me show you. The first thing that has changed is, and the very nature of the case seems to demand that we should make the following points. Ellen White removed this statement, including where it says we, and changed it as if it all came from James instead. You may say, well, James is dead now, so it wouldn't be right to say we anymore. But then why doesn't she write this in first person? The original passage says we, inferring a joint defense. But now that she was exposed, it appears she removed herself from the sentence to further distance herself from these claims. There are some other mild changes which are not worth noting, but for the sake of thoroughness, I will highlight them in blue. Next, we see that Ellen White erases James' comment that if she gathers facts from a human mind in a single case, she has in thousands of cases, and God has not shown her these things, which she has written in these personal testimonies. She replaces this sentence with something new. If, as has been the case in a few instances, individuals who received personal testimonies denied their correctness, so many have risen up to testify to the facts brought out, or time has so clearly proved their truthfulness that her testimonies have been vindicated, often by those who have no sympathy with her work. Here she is changing what her husband had written 7 years after his death in 1881. She continues to erase the following 2 paragraphs that discuss that she does not gather at times from books as others do, or from sermons from the pulpit, and that it required more faith to believe that she had learned these from others than to believe she learned these from the Spirit of God. Next, she erases the spirit of prophecy in the final 2 paragraphs. It makes you wonder why a prophet would go back and change the biography written about them, defending their source of information. I don't know how else to see this other than she had the intent to cover her tracks, once exposed by Canwright. This is why this same year, 1888, was the first and only time she gave credit in any of her books, as we saw in Part 3. However, after the press died down, She continued to plagiarize in her next books, such as Patriarchs and Prophets, Steps to Christ, and Desire of Ages, all without any credit. It certainly raises the question, why would you begin to give credit in 1888 and then withhold credit in any book after that date? Withholding, in my opinion, demonstrates her intent. She wanted her books and visions to appear to be inspired by God. So we have looked at visions, but I want to show you one more example, this time a dream from 1890. Here Ellen White again uses selections from the German theologian Friedrich Krummacher in her Heavenly Sent Illumination from Heaven. This example is from Dirk Anderson's website, and I will include a link below. It's important to note that at times Ellen White used her diaries as a sketchpad for future testimonies. She wrote in 1905, "I am now looking over my diaries and copies of letters written for several years back. Commencing before I went to Europe, before you were born, I have the most precious matter to reproduce and place before the people in testimony form. While I am able to do this work, the people must have these things to revive past history, that they may see that there is one straight chain of truth, without one heretical sentence, in that which I have written. This, I am instructed, is to be a living letter to all in regard to my faith." As Anderson points out, Mrs. White wrote material into her diaries for later use in her books, articles, and letters. Mrs. White was aware that whatever she wrote could later appear in print. She wrote of her literary assistant, Marion Davis, "She gathers materials from my diaries, from my letters, and from the articles published in the papers. She has been with me for 25 years and has constantly been gaining increasing ability for the work of classifying and grouping my writings." So let's take a look at this diary example. Unfortunately, the diary has not been printed in book form, so there is no original book to show here. However, you can find this example on the official Ellen White Writings website linked below. Ellen began her diary this way. "During the night season, I was specially moved upon by the Spirit of God. My soul had been drawn out in earnest supplication to God. I was distressed on account of the backsliding of his people. While lying in bed, unable to sleep because of the burden resting upon me, I was pleading with the Lord. I fell asleep, and in the night season I was taught of God. My guide said, 'I have a work for you to do. You must speak the words given you by the Lord. After these words have been spoken, your duty here is done. You are not required to enter into details before individuals, whatever may be their position or work, if they do not recognize the voice of God in the message he gives you to bear in his name. All your efforts to remove their doubts will be of no avail if they gather the clouds of darkness about their souls. If you enter into particulars, you weaken the message. It is not you speaking, but the Lord speaking through you. Those who want to know the will of God, who do not desire to follow their own will and judgment, will be easily entreated. They will be ready to discern the right way. The whys and wherefores are concealed from you, yet speak the words I give you, however painful it may be to you. The ways in which God leads his people are generally mysterious. You have asked to know God's way. Your supplication has been answered. God knows better than you do what is good and essential for his children. He never leads them otherwise than they would wish to be led if they were able to see as clearly as he does. The people whom God is leading must venture out upon his word. They must walk forward by faith." Now, even in her dreams, she is copying ideas from Friedrich Krummacher. From the same book she copied a vision from that I demonstrated earlier with Testimonies for the Church, Volume 5. So there are a few important things to consider. Number one, she says she was moved upon by the Spirit of God. She then fell asleep and was taught by God using a heavenly guide. She claims this heavenly guide told her these things, which are actually from a German author that was translated to English and was known to be in Ellen White's collection. Now, I don't know if she ever meant for this to be published. As we read before, she did use her diaries at times for future material that her assistants would then search through when writing her books. However, if we say that she did not mean for it to be published, then that begs the question, was she crazy and could not discern what was from God and what was her imagination, or from what she previously read from other authors? Either option is troubling for the Adventists, but given the extent of her plagiarism elsewhere, this diary entry is not surprising, and thus I do not know how to reconcile this as anything other than deliberate dishonesty. What struck me was that, as I was researching this specific quote, I found that Denis Fortin, a professor of historical theology at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary at Andrews University, had used this copied diary quote to discuss Ellen White's perception of her authority in one of his graduate classes. Which makes you wonder how many seminary students are under the impression that this quote came from heaven instead of from Mr. Krummacher. I'll include a link to 14's lecture class outline below. So why is she dishonest and misleading us as to the source? I feel these are reasonable questions. The implied heavenly source is what gives her words weight. If we say, well, some of what she says is from other authors, but we do not know which is from God and which is from man because she refuses to quote, we cannot know for ourselves what is from God and what is not. And how could we when she wrote the same year, the Holy Ghost is the author of the Scriptures and of the spirit of prophecy? So, transitioning now, we have seen how her visions and dreams have alternative origins and how her health reform is necessary for salvation. But let's look a little further to see what else she claimed we must do. Her assertion of divine inspiration and authority meet together in one letter in the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald from January 20, 1903. Here, E.R. Palmer is the editor and is publishing this letter from Ellen White to give to the Adventists. I'm going to read the whole thing so you can see the entire context. The editor writes, "We hasten to bring this letter in your hands, for it is indeed a very precious one. It comes at a most timely admonition to stir us up the work that must be finished without further delay. Our hearts thrill with joy as we read the cheering words. I have been instructed that the canvassing work is to be revived, and that is to be carried forward with increasing success, and a blessing will attend those who engage in it with earnestness and diligence. Bless the Lord for his assurance and promise." Our hearts respond, "Amen, even so it shall be revived." And let all the people say, "Amen." Forward to the world must be our motto. Scores are offering themselves for service around the seas. There was never before such a movement among us toward foreign lands. The sound of a going is heard. Let us be up and moving. We call upon our dear people to respond to this appeal by a full consecration to the good work, that all Israel may be on the march for the goodly land. May God bless you is our prayer. Then Ellen's letter is shown. Dear brethren and sisters, the new year is just before us, and plans should be laid for earnest, persevering effort in the Master's service. There is much to be done to advance the work of God. I have been instructed that the canvassing work is to be revived, and that it is to be carried forward with increasing success. It is the Lord's work, and a blessing will attend those who engage it with earnestness and diligence. Ellen says that God instructed her that the selling of her books should be revived, and that it is the Lord's work to do so. I thank my Heavenly Father for the interest that my brethren and sisters have taken in the circulation of Christ's Object Lessons. By the sale of this book, great good has been accomplished, and the work should be continued. But the efforts of our people should not be confined to this one book. The work of the Lord includes more than one line of service. Christ's Object Lessons is to live and do its appointed work, but not all the thought and effort of God's people are to be given to its circulation. The larger books, Patriarchs and Prophets, Great Controversy and Desire of Ages, should be sold everywhere. These books contain truth for this time, truth that is to be proclaimed in all parts of the world. Nothing is to hinder their sale. Again, she's instructing Adventists to sell her books, that nothing should hinder their sale. She continues, the effort to circulate Christ's Object Lessons has demonstrated what can be done in the canvassing field. This effort is a never-to-be-forgotten lesson on how to canvass in the prayerful, trustful way that brings success. Many more of our larger books might have been sold if church members had been awake to the importance of the truths these books contain and had realized their responsibility to circulate them. It's almost as if she's reprimanding Adventists for not selling her books here. Somehow they did not realize their responsibility to God to sell them. My brethren and sisters, will you not now make an effort to circulate these books? And will you not bring into this effort the enthusiasm that you brought into the effort to sell Christ's Object Lessons? In selling this book, many have learned how to handle the larger books. They have obtained an experience that has prepared them to enter the canvassing field. Now notice what she says next. Again, this is written in 1903. Sister White is not the originator of these books. They contain the instruction that during her life work God has been giving her. They contain the precious, comforting light that God has graciously given his servant to be given to the world. From their pages, this light is to shine into the hearts of men and women, leading them to the Savior. The Lord has declared that these books are to be scattered throughout the world. Ellen White again states that she is not the originator of these books. But who is? God. And the Lord has declared that these books are to be scattered throughout the world. So if you do not sell her books, you will be going against the Lord's instruction. There is in them truth which to the receiver is a savor of life unto life. They are silent witnesses for God. In the past they have been the means in the hands of convicting and converting many souls. It's interesting that she doesn't say the Bible has been convicting and converting many souls. But anyways, many have read them with eager expectation and by reading them have been led to see the efficacy of Christ's atonement and to trust in its power. They have been led to commit the keeping of their souls to their Creator, waiting and hoping for the coming of the Savior to take his loved ones to their eternal home. In the future, these books are to make the gospel plain to many others, revealing to them the way of salvation. The Lord has sent his people many instruction, line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little and there a little. Little heed is given to the Bible, and the Lord has given a lesser light to lead men and women to the greater light. Oh, how much good would be accomplished if the books containing this light were read with a determination to carry out the principles they contain. There would be 1,000-fold greater vigilance, 1,000-fold more self-denial and resolute effort, and many more would now be rejoicing in the light of present truth. My brethren and sisters, work earnestly to circulate these books. Put your hearts into this work, and the blessing of God will be with you. Go forth in faith, praying that God will prepare hearts to receive the light. Be pleasant and courteous. Show by a consistent course that you are true Christians. Walk and work in the light of heaven, and your path will be as the path of the just, shining more and more unto the perfect day. Incidentally, I should bring up that currently the General Conference is partnering with the White Estate to soon distribute 1 billion copies of the Great Controversy. Now continuing. Take the books to businessmen, to teachers of the gospel, whose minds have not been called to the special truths for this time, which means Adventism. The message is to be given in the highways, to men who take an active part in the world's work, to the teachers and leaders of the people. Thousands can be reached in the most simple, humble way. The most intellectual, those who are looked upon as the world's most gifted men and women, are often refreshed by the simple words of one who loves God, and who can speak of that love as naturally as the worldling speaks of the things that interest him most deeply. Often the words well prepared and studied have but little influence, but the true, honest expression of a son or daughter of God, spoken in natural simplicity, has power to open the door to hearts that have long been closed against Christ and his love. Now pay attention. After building up that the Lord has instructed the Adventist to sell her books everywhere, she says this: "Let no one think that he is at liberty to fold his hands and do nothing. That anyone can be saved in indolence and inactivity is an utter impossibility. Think of what Christ accomplished during his earthly ministry, how earnest, how untiring were his efforts. He allowed nothing to turn him aside from the work given him." And what is the work given to us by the Lord according to Ellen White? To sell her books. Ellen White is implying here that if you are lazy and do not sell her books, you will not be saved. Let that sink in for a minute. Ramik wrote on her intent, "It is impossible to imagine the intention of Ellen G. White as reflected in her writings and the unquestionably prodigious efforts involved therein was anything other than a sincerely motivated and unselfish effort to place the understandings of biblical truth in a coherent form for all to see and comprehend." So I ask you, Mr. Ramik, have you thought about what may be the true intention of Ellen White with her books? She has built an empire by plagiarizing other authors. You claim a plagiarist is one who always hopes that they will not be found out and takes from others with the intention it came from them. Well, if she is not using quotations, if she is saying her books contain the instruction of God, if she is claiming an angel told her something that actually came from another author, if she adds additional requirements of salvation not stated in the Bible, and then places her name on these books and instructs her followers to sell them because God instructs them to do so, what is her intention? I don't see how her intention could be anything other than she intended to pass herself off as an inspired writer while concealing the true source of her information, so that many would purchase her books, believing it to contain new light from heaven. I've tried, but I cannot reconcile, after seeing the examples in this video and elsewhere, how this woman can be trustworthy. What's interesting is that this idea that we cannot be saved by indolence and inactivity ties in well with her teaching on salvation and the investigative judgment, a doctrine only found in Adventism. Here, 5 years before the letter we just read was published, in the 1888 edition of The Great Controversy, she wrote in the chapter, The Investigative Judgment, "Every man's work passes in review before God and is registered for faithfulness or unfaithfulness. Opposite each name in the books of heaven is entered with terrible exactness every wrong word, every selfish act, every unfulfilled duty," which could be many Adventist duties, such as practicing health reform and selling her books, "and every secret sin, with every artful dissembling, heaven sent warnings such as those in her testimonies or health reform, or reproofs neglected, wasted moments, unimproved opportunities, the influence exerted for good or for evil, with its far-reaching results, are all chronicled by the recording angel." So there is an angel somewhere writing down every time you neglect Ellen White's instruction. As the books of record are opened in the judgment, the lives of all who believed on Jesus come in review before God. Beginning with those who first lived upon the earth, our advocate presents the cases of each successive generation and closes with the living. Every name is mentioned, every case closely investigated. Names are accepted, names rejected. When any have sins remaining upon the books of record, unrepented of and unforgiven, their names will be blotted out of the book of life, and the record of their good deeds will be erased from the book of God's remembrance. So she paints this picture to Adventists that wasted moments, unfulfilled duties, rejected heaven-sent warnings, such as her messages to the Battle Creek Church or warnings on health reform, all of these acts or lack of will be weighed with terrible exactness and will pass in review before God in heaven to decide your eternal destiny. This is the hold Ellen has on Adventists. This is why she is not simply a peripheral figure in the Adventist Church. Her claims anchor her warnings and views to the investigative judgment. And if you disregard what she says, it will bring unfaithfulness to your record in heaven. As we saw earlier, if you reject her messages, you reject the Creator. She is at the very core of Adventist salvation. This is why discovering where her material comes from is important. We need to see if she is who she says she was. But, a popular claim in the church by those who defend her plagiarism is that no one cared about plagiarism back then, or there was no such thing as plagiarism in the late 1800s. So as with the beginning of my Part 3 video, the best way to know is to look at sources from the 1800s, because none of them are alive anymore for us to question. They have all been food for worms, if you want to use the colloquialism. And to me, looking at Adventist documents from the 1800s is vastly superior in evaluating this issue when considering the obvious conflict of interest that the White estate has, especially now that Ellen White's hand has been caught in the cookie jar. If you have not watched Part 3, I recommend watching that video, as I showed an example from the Advent Review and Herald from 1864 that denounced plagiarism. But now let's move forward to 1886. The irony is that even while the Review and Herald and Signs of the Times were denouncing plagiarism, Ellen White was plagiarizing her books. For example, E.J. Waggoner, a physician, pastor, leader in the church, and at the time of this publication, editor for the Signs of the Times, had something to write about plagiarism in this March 4th, 1886 edition. As you can see, Ellen White has the first article in this publication. We also see on the second page, History of the Sabbath by J.N. Andrews, is quoted while she took from this book without acknowledgement. And if you read the old Adventist publications such as Review and Herald and Signs of the Times, you will find quoting other authors was common. For example, on page 135 of this edition, we find the editor Waggoner quoting other writers. But what we are going to focus on is the article written on this page by editor E.J. Waggoner entitled Something About Writing. In this article, Waggoner gives advice to writers. He begins by advising to think about what you wish to write before you put ink to paper. He advises to express yourself in the simplest and most direct manner possible. Then he goes on to say, above all, don't plagiarize. This is a word which has much the same meaning as embezzlement, defalcation, etc. In plain English, it means stealing. Now don't steal. If someone has written something which you think is good, don't try to get the credit by signing your name to it. If you quote it, give the author the credit. If you do not know the author's name or do not wish to give it, at least indicate that the quoted passage is not your own. This is the honest way. To do any other way is to be dishonest. The law does not punish a man for appropriating an article that has been written by another, unless that article has been copyrighted. But such an act is no less dishonorable on that account. Thou shalt not steal. You may have heard Avinis claim that she is not guilty of plagiarism because she could not be punished in a court of law. However, you have just read that Waggoner stated that the plagiarist would still be dishonorable and breaking the 8th commandment. Continuing, besides the sin of plagiarism, there is another thing that is to be considered, and that is the loss of reputation which it brings. A man steals money because he has none and does not like to work. It is very natural to imagine that people steal ideas for the same reason. If your ideas are your own and are expressed in your own style, they may be somewhat crude, but you will get credit for just what you are. But if you take the ideas and expressions of another and pass them off as your own, people will not give you credit for being able to produce anything yourself. Of course, it is understood that there is very little absolute originality. We are all mutually dependent. We know nothing that we have not learned, and what we have learned someone else knew before we did. But we may have combinations of ideas that no one else has, and we may be able to express ideas in a way that has occurred to no one else. This is originality in the common acceptation of the term. If one has not this originality, if he cannot say anything that has not already been said, there is no occasion for him to write. Note that this was written a year before the 1887 edition of The Great Controversy was published that I featured in Part 3, that did not include a single credit. 4 years before Patriarchs and Prophets, 6 years before Steps to Christ, and 12 years before The Desire of Ages was published, all of which are based on plagiarized material. So the next time you see the Adventist Church confidently stating that there was no idea of plagiarism in the 19th century, or that writers didn't care, I want you to remember this article by their own editor, who said, "Above all, do not plagiarize." He related this to stealing and called it a sin. He said, do not sign your name to someone else's written words that you think are good, and that if you do not know the author's name or do not wish to give it, at least indicate that that quoted passage is not your own. This is the honest way, he says. This goes back to intent. A plagiarist does not want to be found out and therefore does not quote because they want the material to appear to come from them. How much more someone claiming to be a messenger of the Lord? Waggoner mentions that even if the law does not punish a man for appropriating an article written by another, that act is no less dishonorable, and then references the 8th commandment. This alone from an editor and leader in the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1886 refutes the main argument of the White Estate. The Ramik report can only provide a legal opinion. Waggoner, Uriah Smith, and others are talking about the moral, ethical reasons of why plagiarism is wrong. And again, for a denomination that champions the 4th commandment, they let Ellen White slide on the 8th. Waggoner also makes it clear that you can have plagiarism without a work under copyright. If it is under copyright, then you risk being sued. But if you steal from another's work that is not under copyright, Waggoner says such an act is no less dishonorable. This again is contrary to what Ramik and the White Estate are arguing, that if you could not be called into court, there is no foul. If you want to learn more about copyright and piracy, I covered these topics in Part 3. Further, Waggoner states that plagiarism brings with it a loss of reputation. Again, this is the reason why Ellen White's plagiarism is an issue for the church. The church cannot call it plagiarism or even draw light to the copying because they cannot afford a loss of reputation in their profit. This is why they use the Ramik report's assertion that she did not plagiarize to change the term used to describe what she did to literary borrowing. We are fed this story in the church that one of the reasons why we know she had spiritual gifts is that she was able to be so prolific with only a 3rd-grade education. Or as we read from the Whites earlier, she was injured and thus her output can only be explained from the Lord. But if she was able to directly copy or paraphrase large amounts of material, it would not be difficult to be prolific, especially when the same material was used over and over again. Not to mention she had a team of literary assistants to help her and did not write as some romantically describe with only a Bible and a lapboard in front of her. Think about it. If you wanted to write a book and could use whatever you could find in a library on a subject without quoting, it would not take long to write a book or many books. If you are of average intelligence, you could piece thoughts together rather quickly. Lastly, Wagner says if you take the ideas and expressions of another and pass them off as your own, people will not give you credit for being able to produce anything yourself. Again, here is the reason why plagiarism is a problem for someone claiming to be a prophet. If she claims to be the messenger of the Lord, the burden of proof rests on her, and to find that she has taken substantial amount of material from others without giving credit makes one wonder about the source of her material. This is why she defended herself in 1867, which we saw earlier, by saying, "That which I have written in regard to health was not taken from books or papers. My views were written independent of books or the opinions of others." Richard Posner, a judge and senior lecturer at the University of Chicago Law School, published a book that we looked at earlier entitled The Little Book of Plagiarism in 2007. And while being a modern book, I believe this statement on plagiarism on page 19 and 20 sums up this major issue with Ellen White. He wrote, "A judgment of plagiarism requires that the copying, besides being deceitful in the sense of misleading the intended readers, induce reliance by them. By this I mean that the reader does something because he thinks the plagiarizing work original that he would not have done had he known the truth. Lawyers call this detrimental reliance, that is, relying to your detriment on a falsehood." Do you think Ellen White's books would have been as successful as they were if Adventists knew how they were made, or if her books did not come with God's instruction to sell them? What about her health advice that Adventists follow at times to their detriment? Isn't this what Posner is talking about, relying to your detriment on a falsehood? Do you think a loss of reputation would have occurred if they knew she copied other books to form her major books, Visions and Dreams? We must remember they were under the impression by the Whites that this was all from her gift. Not to mention she did not want anyone to know where she was copying from and only gave vague credit when Canwright exposed her. But of course she silently went back to plagiarizing after the 1888 exposure. When you start seeing plagiarized parts of Visions and Dreams, I believe the handwriting is on the proverbial wall. But for some Adventists, no amount of evidence is ever enough. But from what I see, plagiarism was clearly defined not only by the dictionaries at the time, as we saw in Part 3, but also despised and called a sin by the editor of one of Adventism's most well-known publications. Not to mention the morality of claiming to see something in vision as a messenger of the Lord and stealing it from a book instead. Now, since Ramik's argument on plagiarism surrounds the idea of intent as an author, I feel it's only fair to also consider what an attorney's intention is. The intention of an attorney is to argue the point of whoever is paying you. I'm not saying that Ramik has intentionally said anything false, but the fact that attorneys can set guilty men free with legal arguments does imply that legal opinion can be made and argued on technicalities. For example, if Ramik believes that Ellen White had no ill intention, then he can argue she was not guilty of plagiarism, even without providing any examples. This is a bold statement for Ramik, who claimed he had only read in full one of her books, The Great Controversy, which also happened to be the only book with credit. Not to mention, he cannot state emphatically that Ellen White is not a plagiarist when he argues that a plagiarist would never admit that they are a plagiarist. That is the whole point. They conceal the source of their ideas. Therefore, because he states Ellen White must have had good intentions, he can then erase the charge of plagiarism, and the White estate can say, "An attorney said she was not a plagiarist." I will close with this. Denis Fortin, a professor of historical theology at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary, Andrews University, was interviewed by Peter Dixon on his podcast SDA Q&A in 2020, which interviews guests from many different views regarding Adventist beliefs and issues. As a well-known and respected Ellen White scholar in the church, I was delighted to hear Mr. Fortin's honesty and candidness regarding the plagiarism debate. In particular, a segment of this interview caught my attention, and that was his admission that the Great Controversy story written by Ellen White in the first 4 chapters of The Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, was 90 to 95% based on John Milton's imaginary take on the rebellion and fall of Lucifer, and how Adam and Eve was deceived by the devil in his book Paradise Lost. Have a listen here to 14.
So a few weeks later, John Andrews comes to Ellen White and he gives him a copy of John Milton's Paradise Lost. She takes the book and she puts it on a high shelf in her kitchen and does not look at it. And then she writes her book, Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, and tells us in the first few chapters the story of the great controversy in heaven before it begins on earth. Now, the whole story with that book is that, and then Ron Numbers brings this up, and Jonathan Butler brings this up, and a few others also bring it up, is that part of the story there that has not been well studied and well explained is that the book did not stay on the shelf forever, likely. Because in 1870, when Ellen White begins to publish the series of 4 books called Spirit of Prophecy, which is the antecedent to the Conflict of the Ages series. Volume 1 is the equivalent of Patriarchs and Prophets. So it has 4 chapters at the very beginning about the great controversy in heaven and how it starts and how it ends up on earth. If you compare these 4 chapters with John Milton's Paradise Lost, I would say about 90 to 95% of the content is very similar to John Milton's Paradise Lost. I don't know if anybody has ever read John Milton's Paradise Lost. It's not a well-known book anymore. A little hard to read. You've got to get into the rhythm of the prose, or the poetry, in fact, and get into it. But about the events, the geography, the theme, how heaven looks like, the conversations, when you compare it to Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, chapters 1 to 4, it's very, very, very similar. That was quite a shock to me when I made that comparison, when I read it.
Just think about that. Not only are her health teachings and theology based on others, but even her framework for the great controversy conflict can be traced back to an imaginative take on the war in heaven. I encourage you to discuss these topics with your family this holiday season. I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas, and remember, Christ is King. I'll see you next year.